Imagine a world where breakthroughs in aging science don't just sit in labs, but are championed in legislatures, prioritized by policymakers, and woven into national health systems. What if the biggest barriers to health span extension isn't the science anymore, but policy? Today's guest is making that vision a reality. Welcome back to Decoding Longevity. I'm your host, Raghav Sehgal, alongside my co-host, Macsue Jacques.
Hi, everyone. In our last episode, we have explored the business and biotech engines powering longevity. Today, we take you to Capitol Hill and beyond. We're talking to someone who is helping to turn research breakthroughs into actionable public policies. Because the promise of longer, healthier lives depends on more than just science. Our guest is Dylan Livingston, founder and CEO of Alliance for Longevity Initiatives, or A4LI, the first nonprofit dedicated to advance federal and state policies in the United States that support healthy human lifespan extension. He's also been featured on Forbes 30 Under 30 for his work, so congratulations, and his social impact, elevating longevity as a public policy priority. Dylan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you guys for having me. I'm excited to be on.
Well, your path into longevity started in politics, before it became kind of a formal field of policy advocacy itself. What happened during COVID-19 that kind of made you shift into campaigning for longevity science at the legislative level? Why do you think policy matters so much for this field, particularly right now?
Yeah, well, that's kind of where my story starts is COVID-19. I guess it starts a little earlier.
Mhm.
I was fortunate to grow up in a family where talking about longevity because of my father was something he kind of talked about at the dinner table a little bit. But, at 12 years old, you kind of, when I got introduced to the space, you kind of don't really appreciate it. You're 12, right? So this was something we talked about in kind of passing growing up, but and I've always known about the field, but it wasn't until COVID that I really wanted to accelerate it. I had worked in politics for a variety of campaigns and organizations in college and, right out of college as well. And during my time in politics, I realized I don't actually care about politics. It's ironic to say, from my position, what I care about is longevity and using politics and policy as a tool to accelerate this field that is saving lives, has the potential to save many lives and reduce suffering in a major way that, I don't think other medical breakthroughs really offer, right? Like longevity is special and this deserves special attention. And, I'm not a biologist, but, even I can see that, right? So, I started my interest in A4LI I guess really started when I was 12, but then, COVID, watching people go into nursing homes and kind of grappling at 22 with the question, why am I okay, but why is grandpa upstairs going to die from COVID, right? And like kind of having all these like realizations about me leaving college and, why COVID does certain things to certain people. It all, I guess, kind of led me back to this longevity world. And I realized I can do some good if I kind of fill up a niche in the space. No one else was really talking about policy from all of the researchers and influencers I had heard speak. They're all talking about investments and companies and, labs and whatnot. But no one was talking really about the public policy angle, except in the way of saying, we need someone to focus on public policy. And so I was like, oh, I'm 22 and maybe insane enough to try to build my own thing at 22. And so that's what I did.
Yeah. Now that is a great story, but I guess for the listeners who are not really familiar, well, I know that I wasn't until I actually met you. I never really heard of anything related to politics and longevity. I was always, in the research side. So for me, that was like a really, really interesting and really new. So for those that don't know, what actually A4LI does and how did you come up with this idea? What is the mission and what makes you different from the traditional health advocacy groups, for example?
Well, what makes us different in the longevity community is I think there's maybe some 501c4s that have popped up, but at the time we were the only designated 501c4 organization that was seeking to represent the longevity industry in a political way, right? And the differentiator there, you all probably are familiar with a 501c3 traditional charity. You give $1,000 and you can write that off on your taxes, but the downside for an advocacy space there is that can't be spent in any sort of lobbying, legislative, political way. And so we set up a 501c4, which has the opposite situation. When people give us money, can't write it off on your taxes, but it goes towards a specific set of policy and social welfare initiatives. So we set that up with that in mind. What A4LI actually does is we bring stakeholders from the industry together. So we work with about 80 companies, research institutions, venture firm, and longevity tech fund are both sponsors. So I appreciate you guys. But we work with a variety of companies from different sectors of the longevity space, biotech, clinicians, lab researchers, investors, advocates, and we kind of bring them all under one roof and we say, hey, what are some policy initiatives that we should focus on that will make your lives easier to get your inventions into the hands of people as soon as possible. Never worked in biotech. I don't know what the pain points are of biotech, on a day-to-day. I understand from firsthand sources, right? But I don't know. So I need to ask. And ultimately, the goal of A4LI is to accelerate this field and, also help society once these therapeutics have been sort of deployed across the population, grapple with the good reality of people living till, 80, 90, maybe beyond in good health. What does society look like? So right now we're really focused on phase one of that, which is like get the drug into the hands of people. And then phase two is how do we reimagine society with this new reality? But, in phase one, we're very focused on working with our companies, understanding their needs, working with the broader community, the advocates, the consumers, the doctors, understand what their needs are and, try to work together to develop policy points that can, affect as many people who want to accelerate this field as possible.
Now, Dylan, I've really seen A4LI grow from a very small org to a really sort of tour de force in the aging field and the legislative context. And you guys have sort of had some really concrete policy outcomes in the very short time you've been. I wouldn't really call it short, but still relative to sort of some of these organizations that have been in the policy space, from a longevity science caucus in Congress to the passage of groundbreaking state laws expanding access to investigational therapies. Can you walk us through some of these really sort of wins that you have had in the last couple of years that you have existed as an org?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so 2022 is when we started. The first year was kind of me putting my floaties on and trying to learn how to swim. But, while that was all going on, our first major initiative was to put together a congressional caucus. I knew from, my political experience that a caucus was an, doable and valuable piece to any nascent industries advocacy effort. A caucus identifies champions. It, allows us to distribute messaging to members of Congress. They're people we can hold events with, right? And really what is needed, look, we have our champions, right? But what is needed is a sea change of thought in Congress about how we approach healthcare. And so advocacy, getting the word out there, engaging with members of Congress about this issue, just on an educational, front, is always part of our work, right? I've had 3 calls with members of Congress offices today, probably had, 12 in the last 2 weeks. I'm just making up numbers, honestly, but a lot. And, a lot of the time, this is still the first time they're hearing about it. Right. Congress people change, staffers change, right? You're talking usually a legislative director. So it's a constant education campaign. And part of the caucus, the easy ask that we make to these people, if they're interested, is, hey, join the caucus. It's a great way for us to just disseminate information and work with you on policy initiatives, right? So that's part of it. That's a constant, right? Education of the newest, updates of, what companies are doing, what the, market system, the market ecosystem looks like. What the economic benefits of this whole thing will be. And then legislatively, we put together this congressional caucus. We started off with 5 members. We've grown that to now 10 and potentially more. So we're getting more people on board with this message. And, now where I think we're at the early stages of actually using this, small but mighty group of lawmakers that we've assembled to actually push for some legislative asks. And it's really an opportune time for longevity, right? We saw in the past year, funding get cut at the NIH for pretty much every institute, 30%. And, it's pretty devastating for, postdocs. It's a tough time out there. When you speak to professors, they're talking about how the next generation is at a disadvantage now. They don't know where to start their career. They're going overseas. But I think there's a unique opportunity specifically for longevity researchers and longevity labs, because this is an administration that does look more favorably than any administration I've seen on this space, right? So I think now we kind of have the perfect combination of interest in Congress from our advocacy work over the last couple of years, plus, interest, inherent interest from the administration to actually maybe move some dollars. Look, this is our second shutdown as of the recording of this call. This is the second shutdown we've experienced in the last 6 months. So who knows? I'm not, don't hold me to that, but
Yeah.
the muscles are there to be flexed. And I think, this is the time to, so federal initiatives like that around funding, around FDA reform, these are the kind of things we push at the federal level. And then you mentioned Montana or right to try. So as sort of a side project in 2023, I didn't think this would really take on legs of its own like it has. I worked with a state senator in Montana named Ken Bogner. And, I kind of just pitched him on the whole longevity idea and he loved it. And he said, what can I do at the state level? And I gave him an option, like a menu of options of what could be done. And one of them was expanding eligibility under the Right to Try Act. And the reason why I said that was a longevity initiative is because there are drugs right now that, maybe don't have a full clinical trials worth of data, but substantial preclinical and phase 1 data that are never going to see the light of day because it costs $1 billion to actually get a drug to market. For whatever reason, not for whatever reason, it's hard to raise $1 billion. People are kind of missing out on treatments that could potentially be effective for someone's personal kind of health profile or based on evidence they've seen that, is sort of preclinical. But then also what the existing right to try law does is you're only eligible if you're a terminally ill patient, which is defined as one who has 6 months to live in this context. And that's a ridiculous cutoff from, everything we talk about in the longevity community. It's about proactive. It's about, repairing damage before it becomes a disease. And once you're in that state of terminal decline, it's probably too late. I mean, that's why we've never seen a right to try piece of news article out that says, wow, patient cured because of right to try. And then nobody's cured because of it, right? Because it's just too hard to fix a broken system, right? But if people are going to if people are interested in maybe taking a senolytic at 50 when they start experiencing some chronic inflammation, it opens up the door, kind of removing this eligibility, the strict eligibility requirements for who can get the drugs. It opens it up to more proactive measures, more proactive kind of drug dosing and things like that at an earlier stage to be more preventative with your health, right? And that's where the longevity initiative comes in on the right to try stuff. So Ken loves that idea. It's also, a fairly popular political topic in like the libertarian Montana circles. And so we ran with it in 2023. It passed pretty easily. And then I went around in 2024 to, clinics and doctors and biotechs and people that I thought would be interested. And I said, hey, look at this, great ecosystem that we've kind of developed. And they said, oh, there's no other rules other than saying people can try drugs here, not who can deliver the drugs or where or when or, how the whole process works. So we passed another law in 2025 that kind of operationalizes that first law. And so now Montana is like open for business. Companies are moving out there. Clinics are opening up. The biggest hospital system out there, Benefis Health, now offering right to try therapeutics, mainly with a longevity focus. So it's very exciting. And watching states kind of have their own right to try regime to attract business and biotech is exciting because it kind of gets back to the founding of America, where we had 13 colonies. We were called these United States, not the United States, because it was a group of states, of countries and small countries that, had their own jurisdictions and can incentivize business in certain ways. So we're getting back to our basics here. And New Hampshire, I guess, caught wind of what happened in Montana and kind of wants to follow suit and, maybe make their jurisdiction the best biotech jurisdiction, right? So it's breeding competition between states. And now New Hampshire is actually going a little further than, not in terms of eligibility, but in terms of incentives for biotechs. So hopefully, maybe a bigger state, does that as well. And even if it's not right to try, watching states compete for being the best biotech jurisdiction is a great development. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, no, it is really fantastic. And I know that there is other places, not just in the United States, but now they're trying to expand this beyond as well. So well done to you. I guess we often hear about those breakthrough therapies and biotech innovation, but a little bit less about how policy, well, this is one great example, but how policy that can actually either accelerate or bottleneck that impact. And what are some of the biggest policy gaps that you can see right now that you think that could be potentially fixed in the near future, or, things that we could start thinking about working on to really shift that later on, or like bring it to now, really?
Yeah. I mean, I think it falls into two buckets, right? I talked about phase 1 of A4LI, and it's like get a drug or drugs or, therapeutics on the market for people to benefit from, right? To live healthier and longer lives. And then we go to phase 2. And so really a lot of our focus right now is on HHS, the agencies under HHS,
Mm.
NIH, FDA, CMS, ARPA, DARPA, things like that. These agencies that fund science are, the targets right now for improvements in the policy ecosystem. And really, I said this today maybe 4 times. If any of the staffers I spoke to are listening, they might be, thinking that I have a line that I use, but it's true. 90% of the diseases that kill us are aging related, right? They're not age related. They're caused by aging, the process of cellular dysfunction over time. And we only spend I think $250 million out of the, $40 billion budget at NIH on this issue that kills 90% of us. I mean, it's just such a gross misallocation of funding.
Absolutely.
And so, I would argue that it should be 90% of the NIH's budget should go to aging research. That's probably not going to happen, but it needs to be more than less than 1%. I think that's a fair standard to kind of hold them to. And so immediate wins is an appropriations ask, right? Like, again, the government keeps shutting down over funding disputes. So there might be better times politically, but we're still going to push on that front at every opportunity we can, because that's the most pressing thing, right? Labs aren't able to train the next generation of scientists. Companies aren't able to get access to SBIR grants. It's just the thing that would really juice this industry up. And also it's, I think, a signal to the private industry and VCs and investors. So it's a de-risk event for them. Having more government funds de-risk some of their investments, but it's also a signal that this is something that the government is legitimizing. So that's the biggest one. I mean, also obviously FDA. I would like to see some semblance of guidance come out by FDA regarding how to actually run a clinical trial, and like they could use TAME as an example. I think a lot of the stuff that you guys are doing at biomarkers of aging and infinite games and understanding more of the biomarkers and endpoints that are actually correlated with a younger phenotype is and genotype, I guess both. I'm not a biologist, guys, so use my terminology, but I would say that what you guys are doing on the private sector there is very valuable, because I don't see the FDA really getting involved with that until the industry has kind of come together and say, okay, this is how we're thinking we're going to do a clinical trial. These are the endpoints we would use. These are the biomarkers we would use, and then present that. That's exactly what Nir Barzilai did, right? He took a basket of diseases. He designed the trial with TAME. He said, here's, and he presented it and they accepted it, right? I think we as an industry need to come together and actually, not just talk about it, but like say, here's what we would do. And it can change over time, totally, right? And I think constant guidance from the FDA is something they do in every other field, but we should start that process. But I don't think that's going to happen until the field kind of comes to an end in some way.
Yeah. I actually talked a little bit about this already, which is when you talk about this to sort of different staffers and sort of talking to both sides of the aisle, and it's a fairly polarized set of staffers, from both sides of the aisle. How do you kind of put together the ideas that longevity research, or let's call it healthy aging research, right, is a really bipartisan issue, right? Well, what language do you bring to policymakers from sort of these diverse viewpoints to get them on board, right?
Yeah,
well, how do you communicate it to them that this is useful in both cases, from both sides of the aisle?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, the bad news for all of us, but the good news for me is that everybody ages.
Yeah.
Right? It's not hard to really relate it to something that pretty much everybody's experienced, right? We've all had a grandparent that has had a disease and we've had to watch it, or a parent or us or whatever it is, right? And so everybody understands everybody's afflicted by it. So there's an inherent interest. Everybody wants to live healthier or longer. That's like the number one truth. We all want to be alive and healthy and happy, right? Those are the 3 fundamental things to make a life good. So everybody kind of gets it, but then again, they don't get it from they understand that longevity means we want to live healthier or longer, but they don't understand what longevity biotech actually is.
Mm.
Like I say, hey, I started A4LI. We represent the longevity field. I usually stop and I say, what is longevity? When I say longevity, what does that mean to you? And then I explain the field to them and I say, you're totally right about your definition of longevity, but we're using it in a different context, talking about drugs targeting the mechanisms of aging and the dysfunctions of your cells that manifest in disease over time. So when you kind of explain it, and the good news about me too is, like I said, I'm not a biologist. So I had to kind of understand this as a politico would understand this. I was in their shoes, right? And I had to understand it in my own way. So I think sometimes I hear scientists talk to, and I don't want to toot my own. You guys are good scientists when it comes to this, but sometimes you get into the nitty gritty and even I start hearing like the monkey symbols in my head. So, you need someone like me who can kind of digest it in their own way, in the way that a Politico would, and then explain it like that. So that's another aspect of it. But then the third thing I'll say is longevity is an issue that really touches so many different areas of life, right? And especially political topics. So for example, when you're talking to a fiscally conservative Republican, what I always hammer home is the fact that we spend over $1 trillion a year on Medicare right now, and that's going to continue to grow. And the majority of that cost is people using like the services of Medicare, right?
Yep.
And so if we can lessen the demand for that, we'll save hundreds of billions of dollars a year in Medicare spending. And if you want to balance the budget, there's no other option. We're not going to, USAID our way out of this.
Yeah.
We need to take big chunks out of it. And Medicare is the biggest chunk, right? So if you talk to someone who's fiscally conservative, that's the kind of talking point you use. If you talk to a Republican that's very pro-military, there is obviously applications here to keep, the most experienced war fighters and generals in tip-top shape for as long as possible, right? That's a strategic advantage, not only because we have healthier people, but we have, people that otherwise would have aged out who've had experience in the military able to participate for longer, right? So that's a talking point that you'd probably use for someone like that. For like a liberal or like a Democrat who is very concerned about, let's say, health equity, right? The talking point that I used earlier today was, longevity is accessible today, right? Like we see the people who are living the longevity lifestyle, but those people are exceedingly wealthy and have time and don't need to work and, have a situation where their kids, they can have a nanny or they can do whatever, right? And they have time to focus only on their health. And they'll probably live a very long time. But look, I worked out today for the first time in a week. I've been traveling, so don't hate on me. But it's hard, right? When you're traveling and you're building a business, or even if you're just not, working a regular job and you have kids or not, it's hard to live that lifestyle, right? And so it is accessible, but only to a very few right now. And what people worry about on that side of the aisle is, if there's a drug available, will that be accessible to everybody or just these wealthy few? And of course, in the beginning, just like everything, a car, a phone, a computer, it was only accessible to the wealthy few. But what happens is, demand goes up and people want to these companies want to make more money. And the way to do that is to have as big of a customer base as possible, right? So, the way to actually create an equitable longevity ecosystem for everybody to benefit from is by pushing on the drug discovery front and making drugs as cheap as possible so everybody can actually take them, or therapeutics, right? Metformin itself, if that's actually a longevity solution that will give you extra healthy years of life expectancy, I think, the TAME trial still needs to be run. They cost what? I think like a cent or less per pill, right?
Yeah.
Everybody can afford that. Every single person on earth can afford that. So that's the kind of talking point you give to someone worried about health equity, right? And you can keep going. But the beautiful thing about longevity is there's a way to tie it into every other kind of political topic, and get different groups interested that way.
Yeah.
Now that is quite incredible, and I think it's also a gift to be able to communicate in different ways as well, the same message really. So that's great. So you also founded the Longevity PAC, the first political action committee focused on longevity science. How does that fit into the broader ecosystem, and why is grassroots support so important for you guys?
Yeah. So I just said this to someone today. While my official title and my day job is, founder and CEO of A4LI, I consider myself, my real job is to be an ecosystem builder. I don't know if this has a negative connotation or not. I don't think it does in this context, but I want to create the longevity industry complex. Like the military industry complex. Let's, change the incentives in Washington to promote longer, healthier lives. That seems like a noble goal and something we should strive for, right? So to that end, there's other things other than just an industry, a political advocacy association to get that kind of bigger vision achieved. And one of those things is a PAC. And actually, when I started, before I started A4LI, my initial thought was to do a PAC, but then I realized, kind of baseline advocacy needed to be done, education needed to be done, events needed to be done, and that could be all done under a 501c4. But what a PAC does is it essentially raises money for candidates. There aren't many candidates running on a longevity platform, but you can look at a number of ways to score a politician and give them support, right? Obviously, if someone's on the caucus, that's a pretty good indication that they support this field. If For example, a candidate in New Hampshire who's running for New Hampshire's first congressional district. His health platform is centered around longevity, right? Like longevity and biology of aging specifically. Like if you go on his website, it's all that, right? So like, we want to be able to support him, right? Because he gets it and he's going to be an ally and advocate of this mission in Congress. So that's what a PAC does. And we've done a little bit of fundraising with that. To be honest with you guys, I'm terrified of the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission. So I just try to like raise money other ways, but the PAC is an important part. And as A4LI grows, I'll be able to hopefully put more attention on the PAC and raising money through other channels. Right? What this field needs is money. And that's everybody. We all need money. Money make the world go round. Like that's everybody needs money. We all know it. But doing that in multiple different avenues with different purposes is like how this kind of ecosystem that I'm looking to build actually gets built.
Yeah. Now, Dylan, before we let you go, I do have two final questions for you. What's the one thing you would want every listener to understand about how policy will really shape the future of healthy aging, like in one sentence? And my second question to you would be, who is the one person, or maybe two, you would really recommend to have here on this podcast to give a stronger message to really propagate the sort of gospel for longevity and policy? Yeah. Or maybe five.
One sentence.
What can people do to help this?
You just heard me
policy?
ramble for the last half an hour. You think you can do one sentence?
Yeah.
Advocacy works if there is a motivated constituency behind it. Right. At the end of the day, these are politicians. These are elected officials. Elected being the key word there. They want to get reelected and they listen to their constituents. And so, my ask to everybody listening is if you want to see this done, get involved with what we're doing here. Whether it's coming to our conferences, if you're a company sponsor, if you're, an advocate, come write letters for us, right? Like come volunteer at an event, get involved. Right. Reach out to your local representatives, get involved with your local politics, get involved with your state politics. But like the best example, and I know this is in 5 sentences, so I'm going to try to be quick. But the best example of this is like the Free State Project, right? You see a motivated group of libertarians, a couple thousand move to the state. And, because they're so motivated and vocal, they actually have a lot of power, even though there are only a couple thousand people there. Right. We see it also in like the budget negotiations when, I guess this is the worst, a better example actually is like the AIDS epidemic, right? Like not everybody had AIDS. A lot of people didn't have AIDS, but the advocates, the people who were the AIDS advocates or HIV were the people that were very vocal and committed to this. And they got people who weren't afflicted by this disease to be very vocal and committed, right? So a small group of people can really get a lot done. And a growing group of people can get even more done. So I encourage you, if you actually want to see the government respond to this stuff, it can't just be me knocking doors and, trying to use my smooth talk to get things done. It has to be, that plus you and all of your friends writing a letter every, couple of weeks and, sending a phone call in and saying, hey, have you seen anything about longevity? We want you to support it, right? It takes a village. This is not just me. This is not just our team. This is not just the industry or the companies. This is people who want to benefit from this getting involved too. So I'll stop there. Yeah. That was not 5 sentences again.
No,
sorry.
That was great. To the second question, who would you recommend come on the podcast who you think would be a really good source of disseminating about longevity and policy or maybe something tangential?
So we just at A4LI added 2 new board members to our board. But they're people I've worked with for a long time, very thoughtful people. And I think they're involved with A4LI, so they're very much up to speed on the latest in, policy and very thoughtful about that. But more generally as like ecosystem kind of eagles, they have like the eagle eye vision of the industry and the ecosystem. I would say Carl Flager, if you've had him on.
Yeah, we just had Carl Flager on.
Oh, you did? Oh, all right. Let me give you a different one then. All right. What about Eric Morgan from BioAge?
Oh, Eric Morgan would be great, actually.
He would be great.
Yeah.
Very thoughtful. He's a brilliant guy.
Amazing.
BioAge is awesome, right? So it's, he would be great. Carl would also be great. Yeah, I guess you already got that one. So let me give you one other person. I think you should talk to one of the 2 leaders of this Right to Try movement, either in New Hampshire or Montana. So Ken Bogner or
Oh,
Steve
yes.
Kesselring /
Yeah.
Brian Cole are doing the 2 bills
Yeah.
in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Again, they're not going to talk about this like me, but they have different insights that I think are equally.
Of
They're
course.
actually on the floor and
On
on
the
the ground.
ground. Yeah. Of course. Yeah. I remember meeting Ken Bogner when we were in DC, and
Yeah.
amazing guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Different experience, right? They're the ones, carrying the torch and actually advocating for this in governments, right? So it's a different, kind of
Yeah.
view on the field. So
absolutely. No, that is awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been really inspiring, and it's one thing to talk about the science of aging, but quite another to change the systems that determine who will benefit from the progress that it happens, and where can you get certain treatments as well. So, thank you so much.
Yeah. For our listeners, we will link Dylan's work with all for A4Ella, Longevity Pack, and all his policy resources in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, share, and leave us a review. Thanks again for tuning in. We will see you next time on Decoding Longevity. Thanks again, Dylan.
thanks, everyone.